Well, thank you for joining us for this discussion toward a new Jewish political strategy. My name is Michael Sandel, and I've been assigned to moderate this discussion. We on the panel are keenly aware that of the two major events that are competing for your attention this evening, the vice presidential debate and the National League Baseball Championship opening game. But lest you be tempted to leave early, Al Gore and Jack Kemp have sent word, in deference to our event, that during the first half hour of their debate, nothing whatsoever of any consequence will be said. What better measure of Jewish political clout could there be? Only one. We've also heard from the Atlanta Braves and the St. Louis Cardinals that no runs will be scored in the first 4 innings. Jewish politics is a vast subject with many aspects. There's the politics within the State of Israel and in the Middle East. There's the politics of the Jewish community in the United States. There are political questions that arise in relations between Israel and diaspora Jewry. Our panelists tonight are free to offer their views on one or more of these topics, provided they can do so in no more than 10 minutes. So let me begin by introducing our illustrious group in the order in which they will speak. Ruth Weiss is professor of Yiddish literature and comparative literature at Harvard and director of the Center of Jewish Studies. Shlomo Aveneri is the Herbert Samuel Professor of Political Science at the Hebrew University and this year's recipient of the Israel Prize. Daniel Pipes is the editor of the Middle East Quarterly and a senior lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. And Martin Peretz is the editor-in-chief of the New Republic and lecturer in social studies at Harvard. Ruth Weiss.
Thank you very much. There's a Yiddish expression which says, "Ein Narr weiß man nicht kein halbe Arbeit." This means you don't show a fool half a piece of work. And I guess what that means is that if a person is foolish, you better show him every last word of every last thing that you have said, because otherwise he's likely to misunderstand it. Now, this is about a quarter of a paper, but this being Harvard, I have no doubt that you will all understand me fully. So my question, I think that the question that we are really addressing here is, why have the success of Zionism and the remarkable achievements of the State of Israel not brought security and stability to the Jewish people? Zionism was a movement of great hopefulness because it proposed to help to solve two very difficult sets of problems through one and the same solution. One set of problems was internal. They concerned the need for the Jews to transform themselves into a modern nation. And all of Europe, most nations in Europe had been undergoing the same kind of process of Renaissance and Reformation and Enlightenment and Revolution in response to myriad changes in human perception, organization, technology, and so on. So the Jews, of course, also had to respond collectively as well as individually to the challenges of modernity. And we've been hearing in these last days of this conference, these last few days, of how difficult that has been and how creatively that was done. But the other set of problems that Zionism addressed were specific to the Jews. By the end of the 19th century, it had come to be known as anti-Semitism, and it had itself become a major force of modernity. By anti-Semitism, I do not mean the dislike of the unlike. That seems to me far too broad for these purposes. By anti-Semitism, I mean quite precisely the organization of politics around the negative presence of the Jew, and even more so the negative explanation of the Jew. And by the end of the century, politicians were being elected to office on a platform of anti-Semitism in the very countries where emancipation had held out the greatest promise. So what Zionism said it was doing, as it said at the first Congress in 1897, that it sought to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured home in Palestine. And it believed that the reconstitution of a national territory for the Jews would create the healthful conditions for Jewish nationhood, and by removing the perceived threat of the Jews from among other peoples, lay anti-Semitism to rest. Well, the question then is, why, with that dream realized, does the danger, what Conor Cruz O'Brien calls a siege, why does it persist? I think that it's I'd like to lay out at least an approach to answering this question. Zionism was the end product of a process that had begun thousands of years earlier and could not be changed overnight. In the same way that a cosmetic operation cannot change a systemic condition in the individual, a territorial solution, which is more than cosmetic to be sure, could not alter what I would call a system of political complementarity that had developed over millennia and across several continents. When the Jewish people adjusted to a life in exile as a means of maintaining their religious civilization, they developed a political culture, which is to say a political pattern of behavior that is not only different from other nations, but exactly the opposite of all prevailing, or at least most prevailing models of national existence. It is not just that the Jews brought a new idea of God into history. That's a subject for another conference. What's important here is that Jews brought into history a new model of politics, the politics of a people that would try to maintain its national autonomy without territory, without a central authority, and without powers of self-defense. Now, political dependency assuredly did not mean that the Jews lacked political institutions or that they were outside history. Quite to the contrary. I think that Eli Lederhendler of the Hebrew University is certainly right to challenge Selo Baron's assertion that the Jewish people had become a basically non-political entity. And even more mistaken is Shimon Dubnov's analysis of the Jews as a spiritual people. I think the very opposite is true. Jews had to be supremely involved in political negotiations in order to satisfy the rulers and to adjust to the power structure in the lands where they settled. In order to accommodate to power, they had to find protection always under the wings of a king or a nobility or tsar or state, never through force of arms or threats of mob violence, as other people did, but through proving themselves useful, desirable. Jews were attracted to portable professions, supplying money, information, expertise. They developed highly decentralized modes of authority rather than consolidating around a single leader. Most amazingly, and this is my subject, they adopted, adapted, created, abandoned a succession of languages, a succession of national languages in a mode that really we don't have other models for. And this politics of accommodation often left the Jews far better off than the peasantry, the serfs, the underclass, or other minorities in the same lands. But the politics of accommodation was a complementary arrangement, and the more Jews sought to benefit from the power of the ruler, the greater power the ruler wielded over them. It was the combination, I think, of apparent Jewish strength and essential political dependency that made Jews such an attractive target. Whenever threatened, internally or externally, rulers or ruling classes could conveniently sacrifice the Jews to the threatening group and consolidate power by moving against the Jews from above and below. Violence against the Jews was almost always profitable and almost always without consequence. Now, the process that I'm trying to sketch here is too broad to summarize, but I would like to make several observations about it. This political complementarity between Jews and Gentiles they lived among had a theological component, in fact, was based on a theological issue. Jews believed that their suspension of political power was part of a divine struggle, that by continuing to serve, and listen to how this is defined, by continuing to serve the Lord of hosts, the Almighty God, the ruler of the universe, the King of kings, in exile, they were proof of his ultimate dominion. Their sovereignty was assured ultimately because God's sovereignty was supreme. But the people among whom Jews established their communities, worshiping as they did a successor version of the Jewish religion, regarded Jewish dependency as the obvious consequence of Jewish perfidy or inferiority. Because the Jews had refused to accept Jesus or Mohammed, the Jews could be made to suffer with moral impunity. That is to say, religion on both sides reinforced opposing versions of the relation between power and powerlessness. Another point, the political instrumentality of the Jews as a group, as a target, increased with each successive expulsion, massacre, and relocation as their story spread. The myth of the Jew inflated his usefulness because his reputation for evil, for being worthy of being massacred, stood in such marked contrast to his physical vulnerability. Jews felt that they were remarkable because of the way that they could get up after each catastrophe and start again. There's a very famous Yiddish poem by Hay Leivik, which is called Ewig, Forever, and its refrain is, Ich heb sich auf wieder und spanne weg weiter. I pick myself up and I set out once again. Every stanza is a catastrophe. And the refrain is, I pick myself up and I go on again. Well, this was the Jewish view, but of course from a Gentile point of view, they realized their power in remaining always politically and physically superior to the Jews for the same reason. Now, this problem, of course, came to a head in the modern period with the rise of national politics, and this is the thing that would have to be sketched, I think, and explained in greatest detail. Modern nationalism took many different forms, and every modern nationalism was different. But wherever Jews had settled, their political prominence combined with their political dependency to make them the potential objectification of who we are as a national identity and who is not part of us. And I believe that it is this political complementarity between the politics of accommodation and politics through power, which is what we usually mean by politics, this culminated in the Holocaust, which is an unfortunate theological term that inhibits our understanding of the political process it signifies. During World War II, the Jewish experiment in political dependency was crushed by the strategies that had arisen in response to it, by an anti-Semitism that was more protean than the Jews, and as diverse as the nations of Europe, basically independent of the actual nature of the Jew. Well, Zionism had addressed this problem of political complementarity by finding, as I said, one and the same solution, the same alternative to this pattern for both Jews and anti-Semites, sovereign Jewish statehood. And I think that this was exactly the problem that it was addressing. However, what Zionism could not foresee was that this system of political complementarity had become so useful to other nations that they would not give it up just because the Jews had changed. From the Arab perspective, the Jewish state remains a vehicle around which to organize negative politics, whether or not that state declared its sovereignty. The Arab states behaved towards the contingent state of Israel the way they behaved towards the contingent Jewish people. The organization of Arab politics around the negative presence, and even more so around the negative explanation of the Jew, picked up just where the destruction of European Jewry left off. And since I would say the Arabs are facing a very long and difficult process of modernization during the next few centuries, they are going to be tempted to use and reuse this tried and true political tool. The Jews now have a territory means that Arab politics are organized in part around the territorial presence of the Jew. But it should be remembered that, for example, as soon as Egypt gained back the territory that it considered its own, anti-Semitism in Egypt began to take other ethnological forms. The spread of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the news that the Jew is trying to poison their chewing gum, and so forth. And I think that we owe half an apology, at least I do, to Jean-Paul Sartre's book on anti-Semite and Jew, which is immensely flawed, and all our lives we have been focusing on the flaws of it, I think. But I think that Jean-Paul Sartre did see in his study of the Jewish question the instrumentality of anti-Semitism and how independent it is of the actual nature of the Jews. So I would say that in some ways the situation facing Jews today is more rather than less difficult than it was 100 years ago. And this is a very bitter thing for us to face. And I have many reasons for this, but I'll just very briefly say three. One reason is that the precedent of the Holocaust has universalized the idea that the Jews can be crushed without consequence. They are made for the part. I am amazed that Jews really believe that advertising the Holocaust is a prophylactic device against being singled out as an enemy. Everything you know about human nature, about human politics, will prove to you the exact opposite. The Holocaust Museum is a museum to the triumph of anti-Semitism and to the failure of Jewish political strategy. And I think that that is the way it ought to be. We can commemorate, as Jews, we can commemorate the Holocaust, but I think that in terms of the world, it has to be stated in political terms, and unfortunately, that is what it signifies. Second point is that there is not, unfortunately, in the Arab world, hardly the beginning of an indigenous liberal tradition of the kind that fosters self-containment, national tolerance, democratic rights. And if we believe that a strong culture of democracy and rule of law are conducive to tolerance of the Jews, then the absence of these features in the Arab world is troubling. And the third and perhaps most troubling thing is that I think Palestinian Arabs are the first people, the content of whose nationalism, modern nationalism, was actually formed and consists almost exclusively of opposition to the Jews. I mean, anti-Semitism was a component of German nationalism. It was a component of Polish nationalism. It was a component of other nationalisms. But if you look at Arab nationalism, and particularly Palestinian nationalism, that is its main content. And moreover, the only legitimacy that Palestinian Arabs are accorded by the other Arab states is as a weapon against Israel. So that reinforces that element in their idea of themselves. On the other hand, I would say that the Jewish people has now a territory, a centralized government, and the powers of self-defense. Jewish experiment in political dependency lasted for almost 2,000 years, some would say longer, and the complementarity that anti-Jewish politics has been developing during that period of time is very, very powerful today. So I would say that the goal of Jewish political strategy is to break that pattern at all costs and to insist at all times on reciprocity as the only way for the Jews and other nations can relate. Thank you.
Well, let me first say that being the only Israeli on the panel, I feel in a minority, so I feel like Jews in the diaspora, so I can empathize. I'm going very briefly to touch on three subjects, and they will be in a way be disjointed, but there may be a common denominator. I would like to make some comments on the issue of power and powerlessness. I would like to address the question of who speaks for the Jews, and I'll have a final comment on the Holocaust and the politics of Jewish identity. When a Jewish doctor by the name of Dr. Baruch Goldstein assassinated 29 Arab Muslims at one of the holiest shrines to Judaism and to Islam, his name was not known to most Israelis. But after this terrible act in which he himself was murdered by an Arab mob, some Israeli TV film was shown in which just a few weeks earlier, when President Weizmann visited Hebron and Kiryat Arba in order to reach out after the Oslo Agreement to the justifiably worried Jewish settlers in Hebron, it appeared that Goldstein was seen in one of the segments, and very few people before his terrible act were aware who the person was. He appeared as a demonstrator against Oslo and against the visit of President Weizmann. He was armed with a submachine gun, and he had a Jewish star, Jude, on his breast. Now, here you have a person protected by the Israeli army, living in Hebron because of the Israeli force of arms and the historical links that led to it, himself wearing a gun and thinking that he is a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. Nothing could epitomize in a more dramatic and tragic way the inability of some Jewish people, some in Israel, many in the diaspora, many in the United States, to make the jump between the politics of powerlessness, at which Jews, and I think Ruth Weiss suggested some very good ideas about it earlier, were able to adapt to the ethics of powerlessness and were able to create a conduct of ethics which was exemplary precisely because of their vulnerability and their lack of power and their powerlessness, to adjust to the fact that when one wears the Jewish star and carries a gun, there is some tension between the two. We are not powerless less anymore. And the ethics of powerlessness is very different from the kind of ethics which we have to develop today, which is the ethics of power, which doesn't mean one should use power in the way it has always been used. It doesn't mean we should be like Kechol HaGoyim or the worst of them. It means that there is an extra burden on the Jewish people in our generation because it has a gun and it has power and it rules over other people. And we have never been, in the last 2,000 years, used to that kind of dilemma. How do you wear the gun and know what the restraints are? Obviously, Baruch Goldstein and others were not aware and are still not aware of the extra dimension of the burden of power and possessing the gun. And this raises a lot of issues which traditional Jewish ethics, the ethics of the Gola, does not give an answer to. Perhaps some of the prophetic ethics does, but the prophets were talking truth to power. They were saying to kings, Ratzachta v'gam yarashta. They were saying to kings, Ata ha'ish, you are the man. They were confronting power. In the Galut, we were confronting powerlessness, and we have to adapt. And I'm not sure all of us have made the transition. My second point has to do with what has been the major achievement of Zionism, with a lot of internal tensions, and this is creating a public sphere for the Jews, reconstituting the Jewish public sphere, or to use a traditional Jewish word, not exactly Hebrew, more Aramaic, of Greek origin, parhesia, the public sphere of Jewish life. And this public sphere is the state of Israel. Understandably, I will not make the claim that the state of Israel speaks for all the Jews. Obviously, it does not. But it speaks for Jewish power and for a Jewish public sphere, and it speaks out of considerations of responsibility. One may agree or disagree with the Israeli government of the day, but every Israeli government, every Israeli prime minister, every Israeli minister of defense, every wielder of power in Israel is aware of the fact that what he or she says or does has consequences. And there are then institutions and mechanisms where those consequences can be checked against reality. Elections, votes of no confidence, demonstrations. You You can lose an election. You may have to resign. And some Israeli prime ministers of the various political parties did it because they were accountable, because the public to which they were accountable was identifiable. The Israeli electorate, which is not totally Jewish, but is primarily Jewish, and you are accountable to your people. The question which still has been left open, and I have no answer to it, and I'm not going to suggest an answer to it, I just want to suggest that it is a dilemma. Who speaks on behalf of the Jewish people on some of the most sensitive issues that not necessarily Israel can be seen as a spokesman? For many years it was considered that Israel, and some organizations are identified with Israel, directly or indirectly, were negotiating with the Germans on issues of reparations. There's a Jewish Claims Conference in which many Jewish organizations are concerned. But Israel was considered to be the inheritor in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the Jewish people when it came to questions of reparations, of shilumim. But who speaks today when issues which are sensitive issues, not all of them, but many of them, connected with the Holocaust, come up? Is it the World Jewish Congress? Well, I was asking, this is wonderful. I mean, I'm asking a rhetorical question and I'm getting answers. I mean, never happened to me before. Thank you, Con. Well, I happen to agree, with the answer, but I was asking a question. Is it the World Jewish Congress, despite the name? I mean, some people really think the World Jewish Congress is the World Jewish Congress. I mean, the Elders of Zion. Not one organization among others, more or less important, more or less powerful. But when, and it's a real issue, when an organization like the World Jewish Congress decides, in a delicate political moment in Austria, to take on somebody like Waldheim, it may create problems for other Jews. For example, at that time, Austria was a transition point for Jews emigrating out of the Soviet Union, and Israel had problems. Israel is at a state which was not consulted whether this campaign should go on. I'm not saying whether it should or should not, but Israel was not consulted, and it found itself with a diplomatic dilemma with Austria. It had to withdraw its ambassador. It had more or less to say to the Austrians, don't send an ambassador, and that at the time when Austria was the only exit point for Jews coming out of the Soviet Union. Somehow the issue was managed. But it could have been catastrophic for the exit of Jews from the Soviet Union. Who makes such a decision? One organization? 10 organizations? Do they have to consult with Israel? Under what conditions? Does Israel have a veto power? Because Israel was left with the consequences. The World Jewish Congress got a lot of publicity. Israel was left with the consequences. We have a very delicate issue with the way in which Auschwitz should be preserved. And it's a difficult issue. It's an issue which raises problems of Jewish identity, Jewish-Polish relations, Jewish-German relations. Especially in the post-communist era, where you can negotiate with the other side. Is an individual rabbi from New York the person who can decide to confront a Catholic convent and create tension? I wouldn't say bad blood, but tension with the Polish church, with the Polish people, because he is considered to be a Jewish rabbi standing for the Jews. Whom did he consult? Which organization? If the Polish government decides to have a conciliatory commemoration of the Kielce pogrom just a few months ago, finally, Poland is ready to accept a responsibility for a terrible pogrom after the Holocaust. One of the most despicable things that happened in Europe after 1945. And an individual Jewish writer, Nobel Prize laureate, is making a speech and then calling on the moment of reconciliation for taking away the crosses from Auschwitz, which maybe should be the Jewish case, I don't know. But was it decided by any Jewish organization, by the State of Israel, which after all represents, in some way or other, 4.5 million Jews? Who speaks for the Jews? This is an issue where if sooner or later we're not going to have a decision, we're going to have a lot of private initiatives, organizational or personal, which may jeopardize and prejudice the way in which the world relates to us. And finally, the politics of identity and the Holocaust. Ruth Weiss and I usually don't agree on many issues, but I think on this issue we agree. For many years, Israel was the civic religion of many American Jews. And many of us in Israel were very happy, but on another level we knew this does create problems. Moral problems, theological problems, political problems. It was very easy to identify with Israel when Israel is winning wars. It was sometimes even very cheap. But it was good. Good for Israel, good for world Jewry. It created solidarity. But in the last few years, many of us are troubled by the emergence of a new civic religion, or a substitute for civic religion. The Holocaust is becoming a symbol for Jewish identity. And it is part of Jewish history. In a way, it's part of what others did to Jews rather than what Jewish history is, in a sense, what did the Jews do. But is the Holocaust really the emblem of Jewish identity? Look at courses at American universities in Jewish studies. You have more courses on the Holocaust than on any other issue. Jews have lived and existed politically and intellectually and spiritually and religiously and created literature and art and whatnot for 3,000 years. And the Holocaust is becoming the issue on which people identify as Jews. And it is also a symbol of death. And since some of my best friends are Christians, I don't want to say anything which may hurt them. But death, after all, and resurrection, but death is a very Christian symbol. It's not exactly a Jewish symbol. A religion of death? V'chayit bam. You should live by them. Life is the symbolism of Jewish existence, not death. Which doesn't mean one should forget or not remember or not recall the Holocaust. But it is not and should not be a symbol. It is an abomination if it becomes a symbol for Jewish life. And we should be very careful about those issues. So without trying to conceptualize all those three issues, which are somehow interconnected, I want to leave you with some thoughts and the need to address this not very easy agenda, which is an outcome of the existence of a Jewish public sphere, the existence of the State of Israel, and the continued existence of the diaspora. And when we want to forge the relationship between the Jewish public sphere, which is Israel, not the only one, but it exists, and it is accountable, and its leaders are accountable, and Jews who live outside of Israel, those are some of the not very easy issues that we should address. And because they're not very easy, sometimes we prefer not to address them. Thank you very much.
I'm not a Jewish strategist, but I do know something about enmity to Jews. And by enmity, I mean people who are self-declared enemies of the Jews. As a Middle Eastern specialist and as a historian, I'd like to take two of these subjects up in the next few minutes. My argument will be that the enemies of the Jews today are not the enemies who they traditionally were. In brief, it's not the Christians but the Muslims, not the right but the left. And I think there's a self-evident Jewish strategy that comes out of these 2 points. To begin with, not Christians but Muslims. The Muslim world is, I believe, the primary locus of anti-Semitism today. And I would take as my illustration a yearbook that the Anti-Defamation League puts out on anti-Semitism worldwide. In dramatic contrast to other parts of the world where the survey recounts the activities of fringe groups, in the Muslim countries, it quotes heads of state, powerful political parties, mainstream newspapers, and leading intellectuals. Elsewhere, anti-Semitism lurks furtively. In the Muslim world, it proudly rules. Also striking, the survey finds that in Western Europe and the Americas, Muslims make up more and more of the threat to Jews. While rightists harass Jews and vandalize Jewish property in Europe, quote, violent attacks with the intent of causing bodily harm were perpetrated in most cases by Muslim extremists, unquote. For example, 1995's only anti-Semitic terrorist act in Europe was carried out not by skinheads, but by an Algerian fundamentalist group, the attempted bombing of a Jewish school near Lyon, France. Muslims from South Africa to Argentina to Sweden also outscore the right in terms of their reach of the anti-Semitic rhetoric and influence. In the United States, for example, it is Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, who has established himself as the most vocal and influential anti-Semite, the man who calls Judaism a god of religion. There are plenty of other indications as well. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been a bestseller in Lebanon. A recent Pakistani movie actually showed a meeting of the Elders of Zion. There have been many vicious attacks on Jews, both rhetorical and in fact, in the last few years. I would say that anti-Semitism has become virtually endemic to Muslim culture. And it has had an influence outside the Muslim world. For example, the Saudi state and Saudi institutions have patronized either anti-Semitic groups or in some ways fostered a feeling against Jews. They've used their money to harm Jewish interests. And so I draw from this the conclusion that anti-Semitism is more serious in the Middle East than in the West, and that Muslims even contribute to the problem in the West. Secondly, looking at history, looking at the right and the left, I'd like to concentrate on what I would call conspiratorial anti-Semitism, the notion that Jews seek to take over the world. This began distinctly as a right-wing phenomenon, in part, as Ruth Weiss had alluded to, due to the emancipation, the perception of Jews as an increased threat, in part, Jews as a symbol of modernity. Reactionaries throughout Europe described the liberal program of democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, and even universal education as the Judaization of Europe. There developed an entire anti-Semitic literature from the 1870s on that propagated these ideas, political platforms, and the like. As she also noted, they didn't really even need Jews in order to propagate this platform. One of the most influential anti-Semitic writers of the late 19th century, Léon Meyrin, wrote his major works while he was serving as archbishop on the remote Indian Ocean island of Mauritius. And of course, Jews still serve in this role today. In Europe, where the key threat to the right is the immigration of Muslims, still the ultimate message has to do with Jews. It's interesting how anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiments are used to lure in new adherents. Once they become members and are taught the inner secrets, they hear about Jews. And of course, the best example of all where Jews are not needed to be anti-Semitic is Japan, where there's a flourishing anti-Semitic literature in which Jews provide a symbol for modernity and also for the United States. This is the tradition. But I believe there's also a leftist anti-Semitism that is quite as important and perhaps more so. The anti-Semitism of the left goes back a century or more. Liberal nationalists worried about the Jews' only partial loyalty to the nation. Militant atheists, following Voltaire's example, blamed Jews for having spawned Christianity. Sophisticates recoiled against the way Orthodox Jews lived and looked. Ex-Jews, like Karl Marx, adopted anti-Semitism as an instrument for their own assimilation. But more important than any of these was the fact that socialists frequently made Jews part of the ruling class and thereby included them with the oppressors who must be fought. Virtually every major figure in the early history of socialism subscribed to these anti-Jewish sentiments, including Friedrich Engels, Charles Fourier, Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx, and Joseph Proudhon. This, however, was just prologue. I believe that leftist anti-Semitism became the major force it is today only after 1945 with the collapse of the Nazi movement. Then came the Soviet period, It almost reached catastrophe in 1953 with the Doctor's Plot, but in the nick of time, Stalin died. It then went somewhat into recession and fully flourished after the June 1967 war between the Arabs and Israel, when the Israeli victory was anathema to the Soviet Union, and when anti-Zionism, a thinly veiled form of anti-Semitism, became a predominant, if not central, theme of Soviet propaganda. While none of the early Marxist-Leninists had deemed Zionists significant enough to devote even a single article to it, after 1967, this theme became a centerpiece of Soviet propaganda, comparable in some ways to its role in Nazi Germany. The impact of the Soviet propaganda apparatus, as I'm sure you know, was immense. The entire Soviet bloc parroted the anti-Jewish and anti-imperialist ideas spewed out from Moscow's machinery. Almost predictably, East Germany, with its unreconstructed Nazis in high positions, stood at the forefront of the anti-Semitic campaign, but they were hardly alone, with all the state propaganda organs joining in. Further, leftists from Japan to France to Mexico slavishly followed suit, fulminating against Zionism and promoting Nazi notions. This also reached the United States, where on the left such figures as Gore Vidal or Lyndon LaRouche picked up this same baton. Nora Levin, one of the foremost students of anti-Semitism in Russia, concludes that Soviet-produced anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist propaganda has now penetrated much of the globe, and its baleful effects cannot be undone. I believe that while anti-Semitism began almost exclusively as a right-wing phenomenon, and today still is associated primarily with fascists, skinheads, and militiamen, a closer look reveals that it has as much and perhaps more importance on the left than on the right. Stalin no less than Hitler. To conclude, I think, going back to the first point about Christianity and Islam, that it is time for Jews to look to Christians as their natural partners. This is a startling idea given the history of the past 2 millennia. But Christians also find themselves under Muslim assault. It is interesting that it is Islam now that the Christian groups most worry about, and not, for example, Marxist-Leninists. And to be specific, I noted before the ADL book on anti-Semitism, the Rutherford Institute of Virginia puts out a comparable handbook on religious liberty around the world, which in effect looks at the persecution of Christians. It looks at upholding and maintaining religious liberty in 43 countries, including 8 in the Middle East, a region it finds to be the one most lacking in terms of religious rights. 2 themes reoccur with great regularity: the repression of non-Muslims, especially Christians, and the restrictions on Muslims who intend to convert to another religion, especially Christianity. There is a natural working alliance here, and of course with liberal Muslims as well. But to begin with, there is a natural Jewish-Christian alliance. And I would say, secondly, having to do with the left and right, that while the right remains the great bogey for many Jews who are afraid of the religious right and so forth, and indeed anecdotal evidence suggests that the president will get more of the Jewish vote even than the 85% he had last time, I do think it is time for Jews to reconsider and to worry a lot more about the problem on the left. Thank you.
We all know that there is a politics to history, to the writing of history, and to the thinking about history. As it came close to the 100th anniversary of the birth of political Zionism, and close also to the 50th anniversary of the State of Israel, I began to work on a book which I call tentatively The God That Did Not Fail. You understand the reference of 4 decades ago, and you understand, I'm sure, the double entendre in the use of the word God. In thinking about what I would say tonight, I prepared myself really by reading some of the post-Zionist literature, from some of which I've learned an enormous amount, from some of which I wonder what is the Gedulah all about. It's an import from the United States, an old import, in fact, sort of like McDonald's and Pizza Hut. In any case, in my book, when it comes out, it will not have the words narrative or meta-narrative or discourse analysis or social construction or postmodern or post-colonial or fetishist. The book will not be a post-Zionist book, and Israel is not a post-Zionist state. Indeed, I suspect that one of the reasons which upsets, one of the reasons that electorally Israel has now turned right is that the population itself suspects that the Labour Party itself has become post-Zionist. In any case, I'm going to drop this particular theme for the moment, and what I want to talk about is the importance to Jews of the fact that Zionism is a success, and to discuss in what ways I think Zionism is a success. There was no guarantee in the first place that Zionism would be a success. Although there were Zionist masses in Europe and America, the Zionists before the war were surely a minority of Jews, in some countries a very small minority. Their authority came with the war and after, when their admixture of analysis and prophecy that European soil was doomed territory for Jews had already been proven true in the blood of millions. Uncontestable evidence. Socialism had failed the Jews, and communism had failed the Jews, and liberalism had failed the Jews, and assimilation had failed them also. Here's how Stefan Zweig put it. Only now did the bankers from their Berlin palaces and sextons from the synagogues of Orthodox congregations, the philosophy professors from Paris and Romanian cabbies, the undertakers' helpers and Nobel Prize winners, the concert singers and hired mourners, the authors and distillers, the haves and the have-nots, the great and the small, the devout and the liberals, the usurers and the sages, the Zionists and the assimilated, the just and the unjust, the baptized and the semi-Jew, understand only now that they were forced into a community of interest. But even Zweig, suddenly alert to his Jewish destiny, would try to elude it, and elude it he did. He wrote in his suicide message, dated February 22, 1942, from Brazil, where he had arrived only 6 months before, that, quote, "Nowhere else would I have preferred to build up a new existence." Brazil, mind you. And another Zweig, Arnold, not a brother, who did come to Palestine, left in 1948 and went back, never, to communist Germany. Anything was preferable to Palestine. Thorstein Veblen had instructed the Jews that they should abjure the nation and remain creative outsiders in Western culture. Otherwise, Zionism would be a loss to the West, he said. Gandhi urged upon the Jews a continued struggle in Europe, a pacifist struggle against the Nazis. Imagine, such men had authority among the Gentiles and even among the Jews, and there were, of course, Jews who denied their own peoplehood. That conflict is now long over. We are all, so to speak, more or less, Zionists, superficially or deeply, even the post-Zionists. I want to assert two propositions about Zionism. The first is that of all the ideological illuminations of our era, of all the revolutionary transformations, Zionism is the only one to have accomplished what it set out to do, and to have accomplished this with reasonable decency. The narrative of this century is cluttered with brutalized hopes, brutalized language, brutalized bodies, intertwined brutalities. Socialism, communism, pan-Arabism, third worldism, even non-alignment and neutralism, the very word a confession of odious moral cowardice, all of these isms with their grandiose aims and callous means, which enticed so many intellectuals, and so many Jewish intellectuals at that. These beautiful promises, soon they will be, if they are not already, bare memories. Men and women will not understand why other men and women gave their ardors to such monumental falsehoods, and gave also their lives and the lives of others to such falsehoods. Zionism, of course, was acted out on a different stage. It was a movement of a small people, expressive in a certain political way of a tribal tug. In my text, I would read you a wonderful poem by Yankov Gladstein called Untitled Beginning, in Cynthia Ozik's translation. Just look it up. It's a wonderful poem. A small land and a small people, but a daunting aspiration. The Jewish Renaissance in the new old Jewish language in the Jewish homeland. This is not merely about politics, but about a reversal or nullification of the verdicts of history. Even assimilation played its role in this process. Assimilated Jews who were excluded from true participation in European nationalisms educated themselves and others to the necessity of Jewish nationalism. Assimilation was then itself assimilated to the new Jewish reality. In Israel, at least, cosmopolitanism is no longer a rejection of the Jewish context, for the Jewish context is itself a given. The state, the language, the general culture. It is the norm, as it were, within which every experience of and every perspective on human life is possible, and however alien, is not so alien after all. Zionism is in fact the way for Jewish reconciliation with cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism without guilt and without neurosis. A cosmopolitan who is French does not feel a conflict in his soul. Now a Jew doesn't either. This is only one way in which Zionism normalizes the Jew, but it is an important way. Diaspora is a weakness when it is all there is in the presence of a center, or even in the shadow of a center. Diaspora can become healthy, normal, nourishing. My second proposition about Zionism is one that also speaks to its success. And my proposition is this: of all the ventures, not in ideology, but in nation building in the post-war, post-imperial world, God, too many posts here, Zion has also been the one in which a true nation state has been created. But it was created and developed against the greatest of odds. As Ruth pointed out, Zionism has been with the Jews since the destruction of the temple, but it slumbered for 19 centuries. The middle of the 19th century was an era in Europe when ideologies spread like infectious diseases, and one of these ideologies was nationalism. The 1948 revolutions and many of their recurrences in the next half century were national revolutions altogether consistent with liberal ideas, or so at least their tribunes thought. Although Zionism could not yet mean the taking up of arms or the overthrow of governments, it was a representative, even typical nationalism. The great distinction between it and the other revolutionary nationalisms developing in the same ambit was that the soil which it aimed to settle and master was far away. Thus, Zionism was, of necessity, first of all, a revolution in the consciousness of the Jews. They had to begin to see their problem as a national problem. I do not intend here a historical review. Suffice it to say, when the mendicant delegations came to the Paris Peace Conference to assert their claims for particular pieces of the Ottoman Empire, and thereby their rights to that self-determination touted in Wilson's 14 points, the Zionists were there too, one among many self-appointed nationalist groups. But the Zionist title had to wait another 30 years to win the world's grudging acceptance And in the meantime, the world, or at least its bien-pensants, had grown tired of nationalism and thought it inappropriate, at least inappropriate for Europeans. The Party of Progress was sure that Jewish primordial loyalties did not exist, that national character was a lag from the racists, that tradition and collective memory were inventions and improvisations only of the tyrants and the demagogues. So certain was that party that it had no inkling of what was utterly unprepared for the embers burning in the transnational and multi-ethnic empires of Europe. Certain also was it that Zionism was of little moment and in the end also little needed. The Party of Progress was wrong on every count. We are now reaching the 50th anniversary of the Jewish state. Whatever its flaws and however much we may or may not differ with some of its policies, it is a state of laws. And though it has no written constitution, the constitutional theory of the Western democracies guide its highest courts, and then some. Judge Alex Kaczynski of the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals, writing in a magazine called The New Republic on the High Court of Justice's Domaniok decision, wrote, "It is a brilliant opinion, powerful in its understatement, painfully thorough. It will surely become a model of how a court confronting a difficult and painful subject ought to comport itself. Jews can take pride that Judaism's age-old commitment to the rule of law did not waver. But is it right? This is all in quotes. Evaluated by American legal principles, the opinion is hard to defend. Our own Supreme Court, even in the heyday of Warren, Brennan, and Marshall, would likely have reached a different result. Subtly woven into the common law woof of the Israeli court's opinion are the warped threads of Talmudic law, the willingness to admit any evidence, even of doubtful reliability, so long as it helps the accused." End quote. This may not always be, I tell you, I felt a surge of pride when I read this, actually. It may not be prudent, but it is exquisite and also unrivaled. I believe it unrivaled even among the advanced countries. But Israel was not born 500 years ago or 100, although it bears comparisons with the most decent of those that were. Israel was born in the age of decolonization in the company of dozens of other states, some far more homogeneous, and all, so to speak, with its populations in place. These are, as the social scientists say, its comparative cohort. Each of them was an experiment in nation building, and it is hard to find one. It is hard to find one, save Israel, where the experience has really worked. In the text which Michael is looking towards me to end, and I will in 2 minutes, in the text I go over some generalities about what is common to the post-colonial proto-nations. I argue that what is most common is its ruthlessness, their ruthlessness. And this has at least one other consequence of relevance to Israel. War is the health of such states, among them their neighbors. They are not accountable, they do not have to explain, and they are never obliged to apologize. Conflict with their neighbors is the rationale for their ruthlessness. Many of the Arab states are too far from Israel to be in salient conflict with it. Others are too frightened. But for still others, it is the reason they give for their particular way in the world, the alibi, as that great Arab historian and political scientist Fuad Ajami has put it. I know that many people say that at long last the routine of war between Arab and Jew will be over. From their mouth to God's ear, as the Yiddish saying puts it, or as an Arab metaphor puts it, fa femina ma, there is water in our mouth. But before we fantasize that school children from Damascus will soon be walking to Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, as part of normal relations between Israel and its neighbors, let's examine the character of the peace that obtains among the Arab and Muslim states. Is Syria truly at peace with Israel, with Lebanon, or Iraq with Syria, or Iran with Iraq, or Saudi Arabia with Yemen, and Egypt with the Sudan, or Morocco with Libya, or Algeria with its own population? None of these states is actually at war with its neighbor, but none of these is actually at peace with its neighbor either. So it's best that we be modest about what peace can mean for two reasons: so that Israel not give up too much, and so that all of us are not, in the end, disenchanted. If some Arab states are willing now to opt out of the habit of violent conflict with Israel, it is not because they experienced an epiphany. It is because their patron disappeared and they have realized that Israel is now, in its own way, a superpower. And it is a superpower because it is a nation whose people are at home with science and all the scientific paradigms on which the future will be built. And this cannot be said of its neighbors. In trying to establish what he meant by the phrase "my people," to establish that there was such a reality as my people, Isaiah Berlin wrote once, "We are only ashamed of people we are akin to, members of a particular community to which we feel we belong. We are ashamed of what our brothers do. Of what strangers do, we might disapprove, but we do not feel ashamed." I may be different from some of you. I have actually very rarely felt truly ashamed of Israel, but I have often felt immensely proud, and pride is a corollary of shame. One is sometimes forced to be proud because Israel feels shame in a neighborhood which does not admit either to shame or to guilt. And that pride that we feel in Israel is not just Israel's strength, it's also our own.
Before we turn to questions from the audience, which we will do in a few moments, I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to one or two themes that emerged in more than one of the talks. First, to begin on what the surprising point of agreement that Shlomo Avineri and Ruth Weiss hit upon in worrying about the role of the Holocaust as what, Shlomo, you call the civic religion, the new civic religion of American Jews. And Ruth, you'd referred to it as a substitute, a poor substitute for a Jewish political strategy. If that's the case, doesn't that suggest that the Holocaust has become a symptom for something that's missing? It's filling a vacuum, whether politically or morally or spiritually or religiously or culturally, in Jewish life. What is, and I would also invite the other members of the panel to address this question, if there is such a vacuum, what is it? What is the emphasis of the Holocaust a symptom of? And if the panelists agree that it's something to worry about, how might that vacuum be filled? By what kind of content? Spiritually and religiously, or politically, as an alternative? Who would like to begin? Ruth?
Well, I know to what your question seems to point, but... oh, sorry. Do you hear me now? Yes. What I would suggest that it has less to do with what is missing than what is more difficult. It has simply become immensely difficult to stand up day after day to the attacks on the State of Israel. And I think that it is very much more convenient to identify, once again, it means falling back into that familiar pattern of the Jew as the victim, of the Jew, of course, as supremely ethical, because who is more ethical than the person who is dead? And who was killed without, without being able really to defend himself. So I think that I know you suggest that there is a form of identity that is missing, a religious consciousness that is missing. All of that may be true, but it seems to me that there's something much more at stake here. It is the political issue, and that is that the Jews have a right to be terrified by their situation today. A people that has worked this hard, and everybody here agrees with that, and all the papers that we've heard in these days agree with that. A people that has worked this hard, that has performed the miraculous, that has transformed itself, that has done everything possible, that it should find itself after that entire process not having secured for itself a change. That is to say that it still is humiliated by the role that it plays in the imagination of other people that single it out. This is so horrifying a reality that I think that one withdraws into the relative, it sounds ridiculous, but into the relative comfort of the dead.
Marty?
Unlike Shlomo, I often agree with Ruth on lots of matters. But I don't agree at all on this. First of all, I think the characterization of the Holocaust as being the central trope in contemporary Jewish life and in American Jewish life is a very dated idea. I'm sure that that the people who build the Holocaust memorials in every town in America where there are 25,000 Jews are all of the older generation, and that what I see among students at Harvard and wherever I go to speak, and I do speak a lot at universities, there is a tremendous hunger for Jewish learning and for substantial Jewish identity and commitment, and it has very little to do, it seems to me, with the Holocaust. Now, given, however, the role of the Holocaust in Jewish history and in the history of the West, I think it would be folly to come to the conclusion that intellectual study on the Holocaust is anything but immensely important. It is, and without making analogies to other to other genocides and to other moral enormities, we see the temptation to Holocaust all over the world. So there's an intellectual rationale for this work, but I think it has less and less, and quite properly, to do with the Jewish search for learning. I mean, what Jews really understand now, young Jews, is that the people of the book is an ignorant people. And I think I understand and other people understand, without remedying that, all kinds of political strategies will be beside the point.
Shlomo?
Let me continue to agree with Ruth, but disagree with the way she tried to explain the phenomenon. One shouldn't say those things, but I'm going to say it. 3 of my grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. Practically all of my family, except my parents, perished in the Holocaust. So existentially, the Holocaust is always present, as far as I'm concerned. And I have no problem with what Marty said, that the intellectual study of the Holocaust should continue to agitate us and even more so them. I have no problem with that. I'm talking about the sacred nature. I mean, it's not that Jews in all cities and towns in the United States have a Holocaust museum. But the point is that the Holocaust Museum in Washington is now the Jewish National Cathedral. This is not funny. People from all over the United States organize tours to Washington. You meet your senator, you see the Capitol, you walk around the White House, it will still allow you to do that, and you go to the National Shrine. American Jews never had a holy place in the United States. There is now a holy place. And people enter it with a hushed voice, and you cannot but enter it with a hushed voice. And you can come out humbled and frightened. So I'm talking about the sacralization of the Holocaust, not about the fact that we should study and we should focus historically and psychologically and theologically. But it seems to me that the answer is not because Jews feel humiliated in the imagination of the others, as Ruth suggested. I think, and perhaps Michael alluded to that, yes, the quest for this strong symbolism of the Holocaust, and it is very strong, attests to a void in American Jewish life. And let me put it this way, I think you would realize that I'm not Haredi or ultra-Orthodox, right? I mean, I'm not. Okay, if anybody will have a doubt about it in a moment, so I want to preface it. It seems to me that the people who do not need the Holocaust Museum are the Haredim. They are not the kind of typical visitor to the Holocaust Museum. They do not make Yom HaShoah or Holocaust memorials into a center because they have a center, with which I happen to disagree, for their Jewish identity. And to me, the Holocaust sacralization in the United States, among so many American Jews, seems to me to be a testimony to the poverty of Jewish life in the United States. If you are not ultra-Orthodox, if you're not Haredi, if you're not Shomer Mitzvot, if you don't really think that religion in its daily life, in your daily life, is the content of your Judaism, and Israel is, first of all, far away, and it's a little bit more complicated and sometimes even controversial, and it's not the way it used to be, and perhaps it's not as besieged as it was many years ago. It still is in danger, it still is besieged, but not as besieged as that. Then you need some other symbol, and then the Holocaust comes out. And my answer to that is, yes, there is an alternative, and let me bring out, I was trying to be very nice. I'm a fundamentalist Zionist. I really believe in the fundamental truth of Zionism, that when you take the longer view, there will be a Jewish people in Israel, and in the diaspora, I don't know, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, there probably will be only Haredim. And somebody who opts for the Haredi option in terms of their identity, I happen to disagree, but I think this is an option. But many Jewish people will not. And they may, on an intellectual level, yes, we can have other answers. But in terms of daily life, the upbringing of children, there is an alternative. And the alternative, not necessarily Aliyah. I mean, I would like to see that, but I'm also realistic. But making Israel existentially present in the life and life cycle of every Jewish person, every Jewish family, by having every Jewish child spend a year in Israel. Not just come and spend time in a summer camp, which is fun, but you can do it anywhere, but in everywhere. Have every Jewish family try to factor into the life cycle a sabbatical in Israel, where you stay for a year. It's easier for us academics, more difficult for people in business. I realize it. But strategies can be done. To have the Israeli experience made into the focus of every Jewish major and minor organization. Every Jewish federation should have an Israel desk which should facilitate members of that federation or group of organization come and spend time in Israel. And we have now at Israeli universities altogether about 4,000 American students on an annual basis. They could be 40,000 or 30,000. And don't worry, they will come back to the United States. Most of them will. However, after living in Israel, and I don't have an idealized picture of Israel, but after living in Israel, existentially, and understanding what it means in Israel, including standing in line, if there is a line or something like that, realizing what Israeli politics is about, and the cost you have to pay for political choices in Israel. It's not just feeling good about the choice. There is a cost to it. This is something which can be an alternative to identity. And it seems to me that the sacralization of the Holocaust does address, is an outcome of a void, I'm not saying the void, but a very deep void in American Jewish identity. I think we should try to address it.
Did you want to say something, Dan? Oh, okay. Questions, comments? There are microphones at either side. Go ahead.
Porter, does it work? No. Does it work? Yeah, I know exactly. I'm Jack Nisson Porter. This has to be one of the most depressing panels I've ever heard in my life. Dismal, fearful. I am a very strong Jew, proud of my Judaism. I'm not afraid. The Holocaust Museum, I respectfully disagree, is a sign of our strength as Jews, by the way. But I remember another Zionism, albeit a socialist Zionism. Because if we heard the Zionism from this panel, if there were young people here, we'd probably want to jump off a cliff or something and reject all Zionisms. But I remember another Zionism, a Zionism of Berborachov, Moshe Hess, Beryl Katz-Nelson, Aleph Dalet Gordon, Ben-Gurion, and yes, Mikey Duvdevani, Moshe Karen, labeled fine. It happens that these are labor people, okay. But
even Marty will forgive them.
All right. What have we become? What has happened to us? That's the true postmodernism, is depression, death. That's postmodernism. I see another Zionism, and I know there are people in the audience who agree with me on this. And I want to hear that side of Zionism. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay,
Howard, you want to say?
May I just respond? Look, we know each other, so I mean it's not... No, okay.
You'll assign your book to
another 20,000 of you who would have made Aliyah 2 years ago, and the outcome of the election in Israel might have been different. You know, it's all up to you.
You've told us that over the hundreds of years that the Jews have been in exile, they developed a strategy of dealing with superior political power through concession, accommodation, and negotiation, and that Zionism might be the beginning of a new way of dealing with power. Would you say that the strategy that was developed by Israel during the Rabin Peres years of making unilateral concessions to the Arabs was an example of this galut mentality of trying to reach an accommodation, or maybe even following Marty's idea that labor equals post-Zionism? Is post-Zionism a return to a galut strategy of trying to win peace through giving, as Jews have done for hundreds of years?
Well, I guess they would say Hamavin Yovin. He who understands, will understand, understands something. Of course, that was the subtext, or at least that is the implied idea that I was talking about. The most worrisome moment of my life, and the reason I cannot be so buoyant as Mr. Porter suggests that we be, was in fact the day of the Oslo agreements. And I would remind those people who believe in that, from the point of view of political strategy, that I think never in the history of the world has a country armed its enemies with the expectation of gaining security. I wish I could save the reputation of those who believe in this and who signed it. But I knew then, and I think that anybody who stares history in the face because that's what they learned to do from the age that they were born, knew and would have to know that you cannot change the world through your actions. You have to look for precedents. And if you arm your enemy with the expectation of gaining in security, then you are returning to a strategy of accommodation of a certain kind. I know all the arguments. I would say that the arguments that are made for doing it on pragmatic grounds, because Arafat can do the killing, are immoral grounds. I think they are unethical and immoral grounds. So it's a very, very disturbing period, and I frankly am very depressed by it, and that probably accounts for the tone of sort of depression.
Ruth Weiss is our gracious host at this conference. So what I'm going to say now, I'm going to say with some trepidation and as much restraint as possible. It may not be enough, Ruth, but still. This is a blood libel. One can reasonably... a blood libel. One can reasonably have doubts about Oslo. And I myself had doubts about certain aspects of it, and I'm on record on this. One can even say that people made mistakes, and perhaps historical mistakes. But Oslo was not about unilateral concessions. If Oslo was about unilateral concessions, Camp David was about 10 times more unilateral concessions. And it wasn't. Now, one may hope that one can get from the other side more concessions. And I wish this government, the new government in Israel, and I'm not going to tell you for whom I voted in the last elections, but I did not vote for Benjamin Netanyahu, okay? So I hope this government will be able to get more concessions from Arafat. Fine, more power to it. But let's not rewrite history while we're still around. I mean, you have to realize, and I don't like the gentleman as much as anybody around here, that when you look at the history of the 10 years, and you have an organization and a person like Yasser Arafat, who 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, was committed to the destruction of Israel.
He still is.
If you will give me the benefit of finishing my sentence, then I'll be even able, to negotiate with Jews. Never mind about that. But thank you for your tolerance and for your understanding. But I'm used to it. I mean, I'm at home. That's okay.
And a leopard change his spot?
Okay, thank you. Oh, that's okay. I'm used to it in Israel, so that's fine. There's no problem. You start with that, you end with assassinations of traitors. Yes?
That is demagogy.
Okay. Yes, of course. Of course. I'm glad that that I'm making you angry, okay? Take it. Sit it down. Respond. We may disagree. I'm sure we will wish all the Jewish people well. We may disagree about the means. We may think that the other is wrong. But take it easy. This was not a unilateral concession. You had an organization that was committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. At Camp David, rejected autonomy, and 20 years later accepts it. You will say, for tactical reasons, surely. Are we doing it for the love of anybody else? We're doing it also for tactical and strategic reasons. That's why you have peace. I mean, peace comes around not because somebody becomes peaceful. Peace comes around when both sides realize that the other alternative is too costly to them. And you have then a community of interest, and everybody tries to maximize their interest. And that's fine. You have an organization which talked about all of Palestine to the Arabs, the Jews out, and you have now an organization which, with very bad grace, and not always truthfully, and as President Reagan, whom I usually don't quote, used to say, trust but verify, I mean, you have to be very tough in the negotiations, was ready to accept something which you have to read the Arab press to understand what it was. To the Arabs, to many Palestinians, Oslo was from their point of view treason. Treason to the hope of all of Palestine, treason to throwing the Jews into the sea, treason to a victory over Zionism, and they made the compromise with bad grace, yes. And therefore, let's try to squeeze out of that, of their difficulty, the maximal achievements for us. We can disagree whether the concessions were strong enough, were enough. I'm sure there are in this room people who would negotiate it better. They just didn't have the chance. But I believe them. I believe them. It's always said, I'm sure I could negotiate it better. I have no problem with that. I can show you in 10 minutes how to get a better deal out of Arafat. No problem. It's very easy to do it at Harvard. I mean, the question is, are you able to do it in the real world? So what I would like, that's why I said, with all due respect, blood libel, let's continue to disagree without trying to suggest that the other is Ocher Israel or...
Excuse me, I will not accept that. I spoke very politely, and what I did was to express my opinion.
Okay.
I did not libel anyone. I said that if I could save the reputation of these people, in other words, if I could rewrite history in the future, I would do it. I would do anything to do it. This is my call, my judgment, my opinion. It is no more than my opinion, and it is that I was stating. And I think that one of the problems is of keeping a central government, to move to another point of yours. I'm very sympathetic with one of the points that you raised, and that is the lack of central authority among the Jews. In other words, that it's very wonderful to joke about 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, and all the rest of it. We all love that chen, that charm of the Jewish people and our argumentativeness. But I think that one of the legacies of this politics of accommodation that I'm talking about is the Jews did not learn to have a central authority to which they accord authority. And I think that that is a problem, and it has to do with the legitimacy of debate. I think there are 2 sides, and that is what is going on here. It is not a question, to disagree is not a question of libeling. So.
Okay. Thank you. If I may just I don't want to have the last word because you're going to have it anyway. That's okay. I have no problem with that. What I was suggesting, that we can again disagree about the nature of the agreement. To call the agreement a unilateral concession, this is not so. And if I may just pick up another quarrel with Marty this time, yes, one can disagree with the Labour Party policies. I mean, you know, somebody was once asked, are you a member of the Labour Party or a sympathizer? He said, a member, but not a sympathizer. So, you know, I could say the same about myself. But to say that there was a perception that Labour was taking a post-Zionist position, let me remind you, after Oslo, which came as a shock to many people, almost 70% of Israeli Jews said they agree with it in public opinion polls. Then it went down, mainly because of terrorism and the instrumentalization of terrorism. And we know we live in the real world. So again, one can disagree with the Labour policy. Perhaps Labour did too many concessions. I mean, this is a legitimate position.
I didn't say anything about Oslo.
No, you said the perception was, well, you said the perception may have been, but then you withdrew. I'm glad you withdrew it.
I didn't withdraw anything because I didn't say what you said I said.
You said something about Labour and post-Zionism,
yes.
But if you didn't say that, okay.
No, I did say that.
Okay, fine.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. Professor Weiss spoke earlier about the decentralization of Judaism and that giving rise to a wide variety of thoughts on what it is to be a Jew and disagreements along those lines. My question is, if Israel becomes the central home of Judaism, will it be accommodating to all of these different opinions on Judaism? Can these different types of Judaism coexist, religious, a-religious, different levels of halakha or whatever it might be? And if current difficulties along these lines are any indication, should this be an area where our attention is, where more of our attention is given now when we still do have an external threat that's common to all of us, rather than letting it be an explosive issue when Israel has the opportunity to turn inward?
Okay. Who would like to address?
Well, I have no deep thoughts in it. I think that, of course, the argument has to be argued out. I think that one of the advantages of having a state of one's own and having a Jewish state is the freedom to go through all these very difficult stages of self-transformation that have consumed European societies for many hundreds of years. I think that it would be much more wonderful if one could have the luxury of debating these issues and trying to understand what it means to have a central authority and still admit to the widest possibilities of pluralism. It would be much easier to conduct those kinds of discussions and arguments if one were in a state of relative security. As it happens, all these discussions have to take into account always the consequences of what one is arguing about and compromise perhaps to some degree by those constraints.
Okay. Well, I really agree. I mean, I have no, I agree in a very fundamental sense, and here I want to add something which, element of pride, to go on what Marty said earlier. The fact that, look, let me put it this way, as a political scientist, in my Political Science 101 book, Israel should have been a dictatorship long ago. I mean, external pressure, internal pressure, immigration, I mean, all the reasons that call for a breakdown of democracy have been in Israel for the last 50 years. And the fact that Israel was able, with exceptions, but basically to conduct a political, pluralistic discussion on existential issues, basically creating the mechanism for decision-making, even if occasionally it was challenged, but basically it was there, is a great achievement for Israel. I cannot see many democratic countries that would be able, in an existentially threatened situation, maintain that degree of freedom, pluralism. Are we able to bring in all the elements of Jewish life? I hope so, and therefore we would like to see as much pluralism, and perhaps since you raised the issue of religious pluralism among other issues, I mean, I'm a secular Jew, one would say, but the synagogue to which I do not go is the Orthodox synagogue, okay? Because this is the synagogue to which my grandparents went, and I don't go to that synagogue. I mean, it's not the conservative synagogue. It is the Reform synagogue. It is the Orthodox synagogue to which, thank God, I do not go. However, I would like to see much more pluralism in Israel, of course, regarding Reform Jews, conservative Jews, but it is basically not a philosophical or theological problem. It is a political problem. If we would have 400,000 Reformed conservative Jews in Israel, the political map would be very different. And again, you know where those 400,000 could come from.
Yes.
Well, since it appears that the prerequisite for entering into a discussion of the Holocaust and the relative merits of visiting the Holocaust Museum in the State of Israel, to enter into that discussion, one has to quantify the frequency of one's agreement or disagreement with Ruth Weiss. I'll just say, to begin with, 50-50. And of course, it seems that everyone agrees on this, that the Holocaust museums are bad news, and it's just a question of interpreting the significance of these Holocaust museums for American Jewry. I disagree with Ruth about what really lies behind the popularity, it's an awful word to use in this context, but it's a fact, or the fascination, the morbid fascination with the Holocaust, which is very widespread in American Jewry and also among young American Jews, Marty. I mean, next, and non-Jews, them too. We're talking Jews tonight, and or I am right now. And in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a dinner in New York City for the New York Holocaust Museum, which is yet to be built. And this is the generation-to-generation dinner, and it's all 30-somethings. So. And there's a lot of money at that dinner, so you ought to come and get some prospects. But okay. I think that Ruth, Ruth has raised a false a question. Ruth has raised a false opposition, I think, to a certain extent, between or a discontinuity between American Jews identifying with Israel or making Israel the basis of their Jewish identity, and then now. Somehow there's been this shift, and they're now making the Holocaust the basis of their Jewish identity. I think the impulse is essentially the same, and Shlomo Avineri hinted at that when he said, now that Israel is no longer in mortal danger, Jews turn to the Holocaust for a sense of drama and urgency. And I think the impulse for both, and both are equally superficial and equally lacking in Jewish depth.
Okay. All right.
The impulse is a survivalist impulse, and so I don't think there's much of a difference at all.
Over here.
Yeah, my question is also to Shlomo with regard to the Holocaust. I was in Israel as a high school student when Eichmann was caught. I had never heard of Eichmann's name. I went to my high school in Israel, which was the Yeshiva Tichoni, which were pretty well-informed Jews of 10th graders. Nobody had heard of his name. which means probably the average high school student in Israel in the 50s had not heard of his name. I'm sure in America, nobody heard of his name. As far as I know, the first course on the Holocaust offered in America was in the early 1960s. So in the 1950s, the Holocaust was obliterated from the Israeli and the American memory, except for survivors and their direct relatives. It was not part of the Jewish agenda. As far as I know, in 1952, money was allocated for Yad Vashem. It was pocketed by Ben-Gurion out of the fear that you cannot build a political state on the failure, because after the Holocaust is political failure. Now, I think in the 50s, we were scared of the Holocaust for the simple reason that if people realized the price of Jewishness, they'd run away from it. We were psychologically able to absorb the Holocaust in America after 67. And then Holocaust studies became a factor as Israeli studies. Now here's the interesting thing. You made Holocaust Israel as if it were either or. Psychologically in American Jewry, those people who go to the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations are similar to, frankly, the same people who appear at the Yom Shoah celebrations whose family is not connected. I don't mean survivors. In the 1950s, we had Bergen-Belsen Day, you can recall it. We had Auschwitz Day. We did not have Yom HaShoah. The word did not exist in our vocabulary. Now, the March of the Living had 600 people 10 years ago. I am told that next year they have more than 6,000 people, and there's a significant Israeli contingent. So the question is therefore not either or, and the Holocaust is not filling the vacuum, because the same people committed to Israel, by virtue of Israel, are able to absorb the message of the Holocaust. And the capacity is now both and, not either or. I think it's becoming more psychologically true both of Israel and America. I would like you to comment on that.
Good. Well, let's take that. Well, let's take one more question, and then people can comment on this issue or the next issue, and we'll wind it up.
Mine is quite different. I think it would make
That's
sense.
all right. Go ahead. People can come back as they choose.
I wanted to say how much I appreciated the comments on power and powerlessness. And also that I have not been able to attend all the sessions, but I've come to some, and I've read the program very carefully. The only two references I know of to Palestinians are to Baruch Goldstein's victims, and to Ruth Weiss's comment that anti-Semitism was a component of Nazism, but is the totality of Palestinian opposition to Zionism.
That is not a quote.
Would you repeat your quote, then would you say what you did say? That's how I heard it.
Well, go ahead. You asked your question.
Well, but I don't think I was alone. People.
Well, go ahead. Pose the question, and then we'll let people respond. Go ahead.
Sorry. Right. Okay. I'm enormously. I found the quote enormously upsetting. I thought when I looked at the program and saw Zionism and its opponents, there would be some opportunity for Palestinians, for someone to speak about the Palestinian experience. I think their experience is quite different from the experience of Nazis, and I think it's instructive that in the Israeli forum that you are having, there are a number of opportunities for consideration of issues related to Palestinians. I would like to know, because I think you probably couldn't get away with this in Israel, the way Joan Peters' book was totally dismissed in Israel and received a great deal of positive acclaim here. I'd like to know from the organizers why there is nothing on several days of programming here, at least looking at some of the issues related to the Palestinian, what the Zionist experience has meant to Palestinians.
Well, we have two questions, one about the Holocaust and Israel as focuses of Jewish identity, one about the role of the Palestinians in our discussion of Zionism. And what I'd like to do is let any among the panelists who would like to have a last word about those questions or any others that have gone unanswered to have that opportunity. Who would like to begin?
Just last word, since I was asked a direct question.
Go ahead.
If I may. I don't want to go too much into the history of the Holocaust, the construction of the Holocaust in Israel, but I think we probably disagree about some of the historical facts. After all, Yom HaShoah was instituted, I don't have the exact date, somebody can help me, in the 1950s? 50? 57. Yad Vashem was set up in the early 1950s, and the crucial point, I think here the Israeli experience was different from the American, was the decision to capture Eichmann, bring him to Israel, and have the trial not only as a judicial but also as a historical reckoning with the Shoah. And the Israeli awareness, the deep awareness, and the introduction of the Shoah into the Israeli curriculum, not that it didn't exist before, but it was much less so than later, was really after the Eichmann trial, whereas in the United States it was really 67. And let me add very briefly that it was, after all, Ben-Gurion who was responsible for bringing Eichmann. It was his decision, not an easy political decision. And it is not an accident that the first years after the Shoah were very difficult for everybody, for survivors, for Israeli Jews, for American Jews, to confront the enormity. I mean, we are always shocked again and again when we are confronted with new data. I mean, let's take the Goldhagen book. I mean, this is not an accident that it had such an impact, because again we see something which is really beyond good and evil in our normal moral codex. So I wouldn't criticize any Jewish person, be a survivor or a leader in Israel and the United States, that after 45 it took some year to be able to work out what it really meant. And again, it was Israel that did understand that the Shoah has an impact on world history, and the reparation agreements. And let me remind you who was responsible for the reparation agreement with Germany and who violently opposed the reparation agreement with Germany, was anchoring the Shoah in the collective memory, not only of the Israelis, but of the Germans and the Europeans and world public opinion as well.
I'd like to answer this lady's question with no authority of my own. I neither planned this event nor was consulted about it, and in fact I wondered why I was asked to participate in this particular panel when I thought there were other panels where I would be more apt. But it seems to me that at this moment in this country, whenever Zionism is spoken about, it is spoken about largely in its effect on an encounter with the Palestinians. So this was justifiably, it seems to me, as I looked at the list of panels, I imagine that the Palestinians were not edited out of people's texts, that this was a conference on Zionism as a Jewish political movement. And there are shortages of places and occasions when this topic is on the table. And if you want to learn about the Palestinian encounter with Zionism, you can do it every day, 10 times a day, on every television station, and in the classes taught by Jewish historians who were Zionists and who were not Jewish, right here.
Okay. Well, what I find interesting is the belligerence here of and the assumption behind the belligerence, which is fascinating. You couldn't get away with that here. I have pulled something over on it, or I and the other organizers.
In Israel.
Well, that may be Israel's pathology or what. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it means to get away with things. For one thing, let's just backtrack. If you want to know about the organization of things, I speak only for myself. I think that one of the principles of the organization was historical, that we moved in a certain mode of historicity from past to present-day culture, which is what is there. The other thing is that I think that the Arabs have denied the Jews their country, not the other way around.
I know you think that.
Right. As for my statement, what I said, I will quote it to you. I was misquoted here before. And how one hears things, I think, is very relevant here. I said that the Palestinian Arabs are the first people, and you know everybody says that they are the only people who have a developed nationalism, are the first people, the content whose nationalism was actually formed and consists almost exclusively of opposition to the Jews. I said nothing about the Nazis.
I believe we're talking about two different quotes. I think we're talking about two different quotes. I didn't make it up.
All right.
Okay.
Lest we end on a question about how the conference was organized rather than on the broader theme of a Jewish political strategy, let me put one small question, and whoever wants to can give a brief answer to it. We've talked here about Jewish political strategy, but implicit in most of your remarks was the suggestion that what we're lacking is a Jewish political ethic, which has to come prior to a political strategy. We've talked about the condition of power and powerlessness is forming a political outlook and a political practice. But is it, no one on the panel has mentioned anything about whether the content of a Jewish political ethic needs to be given or doesn't need to be given by some contact with the substance of the Jewish biblical, Talmudic, rabbinic, ethical, and religious tradition. As a closing question, and you can answer this yes or no, do you think that it does or does not need to be informed by that? And has secular Zionism made a mistake by trying to separate its political ethic, never mind its political strategy, from some contact with, some deeper contact with the Jewish tradition? Shlomo.
Again, we should start a new symposium on this. So very briefly, I think the success story of Zionism, which was primarily of secular Zionism, not only, but primarily of secular Zionism, and I think we discussed a little bit of this in the conference, was that it was transforming tradition while at the same time rebelling against it. I mean, look at the seminal terms of secular Zionism or political Zionism. Aliyah, Geulat Haaretz, the redemption of the land, Keren Kayemet. I mean, all those, and there are dozens and dozens of work like that. This is a politicized, nationalized, secularized version of a lot of things that are coming from the Judaic tradition. And perhaps one of the great achievements of Zionism is that it was on one hand a rebellion against tradition, on the other hand, when you look at its vocabulary, it so very much was connected with that tradition, and perhaps in a transformative way. And it created a new dimension for this tradition. People like Ben-Gurion could quote the Bible not because they saw it as a religious inspiration in the divine sense, but because they saw it as a moral inspiration, not just as the title, the historical title to the land, but therefore Or LaGoyim, Am Sgula, all the moral imperatives which he tried to develop and change and perhaps sometimes even abuse in a political, socialist, and Zionist way.
In any case, your question is being answered by the Israeli body politic because the religious and the spiritual content of Israeli society is now very much on the agenda with very diverse views. And I hope, rather differently, I think, than Ruth and Shlomo, that what will not come is greater state authority, but more of the plurality and the liberty of civil society.
I don't think I've ever been on a panel before where I didn't say a word. But let me remind you that the topic here was political strategies in the future. And I think what we've had is, in a sense, a revisionist socialist debate, which is certainly worthy in itself, and as Marty points out, doesn't happen all that often. But I think the original purpose of the session, to think about strategies, is a difficult one and probably worth pursuing despite its difficulties.
Well, my point, I'll just conclude. My point was, if I may go back to it, that I think that a certain political complementarity developed, which is of great danger to the Jews, but if it is of great danger to the Jews, it also works complementarity and it creates a fatal politics. And therefore, that is the ethical answer. In other words, breaking that is the ethical task ahead of us.
Okay. With that, we could go on for all night, but let me thank the panelists and thank all of you for coming.